Hello and welcome to the Town Hall. Today is but one installment in a series entitled Century of Story and Song. The Town Hall was founded in 1921 by a group of suffragists who wanted the space to be a home for adult education, consciousness raising, and civil discussion. However, over the course of the next 99 years, many people came to the hall, many musicians came to the hall, and made the hall's acoustics world-renowned. Isaac Stern, Nina Simone, Bob Dylan, Judy Collins, and many others made really important debuts that changed the course of music history. Today, however, we begin a 4-part series on the little-known history of comedy at the Town Hall. Many comedians came to the hall, including Red Foxx, the subject of tonight's program. Jalylah Burrell is here. I'm so glad to have her speak with us about the history of comedy, in particular, the history of comedy in this period in the 1950s, in the 1960s. She is an assistant professor of African American Studies at San José State University. She holds a PhD in American Studies and African American Studies from Yale University, and her scholarship was previously supported by postdoctoral fellowships at DePaul University's African and Black Diaspora Department and Rice University Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, as well as visiting research fellowships at the Black Film Center/Archives at Indiana University Bloomington, the Vivian G Society, and the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript, Archives, and Rare Book Library at Emory University. Her research and teaching are focused on African diasporic literature and popular culture, and enhanced by experience as a pop culture critic, digital producer, oral historian, and DJ. Her current book project is titled Capacity for Laughter: Black Women and the American Comedic Tradition. Thank you, Jalylah, so much for joining us.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Well, I want to first ask you, you've studied a lot of literature, you've written about literature and pop culture. Can you tell us what brought you to Black women in comedy?
So as a kid growing up in Seattle, I was looking for a funny novel by a Black woman. That's where it started. And I had difficulty. I had just finished reading, I think Ishmael Reed's Japanese by Spring. And then one of my absolute favorites is The White Boy Shuffle by Paul Beatty. And I thought after reading those, I'd love to read something really funny by a Black woman. And, I've got my degrees and everything now, so you can sort of imagine that I knew my way around a library. I went to a really well-resourced school that had excellent holdings. I actually need to shout out my librarian who passed, a Black woman, Brenda Brock, who passed last year. She made sure there were these robust holdings by Black women writers. So I checked there. I was looking in searches, keywords, subject headings that didn't work, tried Seattle Public Libraries. I was on this search for a funny novel by a Black woman, and it was challenging. I couldn't identify one, right? But this was sort of nagging me for years. When I got to college, I encountered at Spelman College, shout out to my Spelman College sisters, when I got to Spelman College, siblings, I should say, my Spelman College siblings. When I got to college, I encountered Fran Ross's Oriole, right? So this is an experimental, uproariously funny novel. I encountered that, and it sort of was like, okay, here it is. But probably one of the reasons I didn't encounter it earlier is that it had been out of print for years. And thanks to the work of the Black woman poet and professor, Harriet Mullen, it was back in print. She wrote a really valuable biographical introduction, an essay, and I was able to engage this work. But what it had me thinking, what is something that I always suspected, was that there was so much of this work out here, so much work by Black women humorists that was out here that was either out of print or that was omitted from the historical record. And I wanted to try to track it down. I sort of deviated and did some other things, writing in New York, primarily about music. But whenever I had an opportunity, I would write about Black women humorists. blackness. I wrote about Fran Ross for a vibe piece that I did. And then when I got to Yale, I decided that this is something that I could finally pursue. I could devote that energy to really to re-encountering this history, because it's been there all along, right? It's just been omitted and shadowed.
Thank you for that. It's a series about live comedy, and I'm interested in where you think we can start in terms of understanding the history of African American comedic traditions. You were talking about written literature, but where would you say we could start in terms of thinking about live performance as well, even if that is written text or folktale,
So we think about the histories of Black diasporic humor in the United States. Of course, they're wide-ranging, right? We can think about oratory. We can think about, including the sermonic tradition. We can think about verbal contests, and ridicule, like the dozens or signifying. And we can think about all the different ways that, enslaved African peoples were engaging each other through humor. We're using it as a form of communication, complex communication, entertainment. So we have all of that, right? It's a human thing to employ humor as a communicative and device, as well as for entertainment. But then when we think about what I call the American Comedic Tradition, it's minstrelsy. Blackface minstrelsy is the foundation not only of the American Comedic Tradition, but the foundation of all of entertainment in the United States, right? It begets the film industry. Think Al Jolson, think Birth of a Nation. It begets radio industry. Think, Amos and Andy, that sitcom, which of course makes the move to television. It begets Broadway through vaudeville. And blackface minstrelsy, of course, which emerged in the 19th century, was this form of musical and theatrical entertainment, which was built on stereotypes of Blackness, right? Featuring first white performers who would artificially darken their skin and exaggerate their features, and then pivoted. And then there were Black male performers primarily, although not exclusively, who entered into that practice. It's the most influential progenitor of American comedic tradition in that it commercialized the exploitation of racial caricature, right? Its foundation is demeaning the other. And that's the foundation of comedy in the US, but it also provided these opportunities when it pivots and Black performers are able to enter, that it becomes also this foundation for Black comedic performance, right? You think of, in relatively contemporary ways, you think about people who evoke the Blackface minstrel tradition. One of my favorite comedians, Bernie Mac, right? Late Bernie Mac. Watch him and watch how he bugs his eyes, right? His gestural repertoire, his expressive repertoire is definitely connected, even as he may be doing other things that are pushing back against it, right? That aren't advancing that same sort of narrative. But that's the foundation. That's what we're still sort of reckoning with, is that sort of legacy of Blackface minstrelsy, in addition to all these other complicated and fun and joyous ways that Black folks have been using humor in interpersonal relationships, as well as in performative engagements.
And you give the example of Bernie Mac. Are there other examples you can give us, maybe that are a little earlier, just to provide, a little bit of a bridge between, minstrelsy of the, 20s, 30s, 40s, and, Mac in the 2000s?
Right. So we think about malapropisms, right? And we see this in many earlier forms of comedy, when this is, right, saying the wrong word, which is sort of indicative of not having the widest sort of vocabulary. We see Jackie Moms Mabley uses this. Many of the performers on the Chitlin circuit. The Chitlin circuit sometimes is referred to as like Black vaudeville. It was the Theater Owners Booking Association circuit. And of course, there's segregated entertainment circuits in this earlier moment in 20th century performance. It was sometimes, so we have Theater Owner Bookings Association, and people would often say it's like tough on Black athletes, right? It was hard. It was not rewarding. It wasn't financially rewarding. Of course, the audiences were engaged, but the challenges were accommodation. The challenges were payment. But even in that, you had a lot of performers who were still performing in blackface. Like that was still much of the standard. They're reproducing this for Black audiences. A relatively contemporary work which speaks back to that moment and gives us some insight into sort of the legacy of blackface minstrelsy is Spike Lee's magnificent film. Of course, the ending is a little that's the problem with a lot of his films. But if we think about Bamboozled, right? So unfortunately, for those who are streaming, you can't stream it, right? You can't stream. There's been conversation about this. You can't stream Bamboozled right now. So for those who haven't watched it, you can buy the DVD if you still have a DVD player, and watch it. But it is, and there aren't a lot of. Honestly, I think there might be one short clip on YouTube. But in Bamboozled, that film is really about this new millennium minstrel show, and in sort of in that modern moment. So think about circa 2000, if there's a new millennial minstrel show. And what's so appropriate is the racist sort of TV exec who greenlights it is played by Michael Rappaport. And it was just perfect casting. It was perfect casting all throughout. But when we think about also speaking to this question of the bridge and the legacy, so also in terms of who's cast as the performers in this new millennial minstrel show, the Roots are the house band, but the performers are Tommy Davidson, one of my favorite comedians of all time. Tommy Davidson is so talented. So we have Tommy Davidson and we have Savion Glover, right? So they are cast as the main sort of stars as this new millennial minstrel show. And what's so well executed in the mounting of this vision by Spike Lee is that at first they go through the tradition of you see them blacking up. They take the cork, right, like cork from the top of a bottle of wine. They burn it, let it turn to ash, add the water, put it on their faces, then put on the red lipstick, right, to exaggerate the features. And they get on stage and they start doing these routines. And first, we see, in terms of when you think about the shot selection, we see the audience extremely uncomfortable and they're not laughing. But then you see these folks, including Black folks in the audience, who break into laughter. And the reason I mention this is if you're seeing Tommy Davidson, right, tremendously skilled comedian, and Savion Glover, tremendously skilled performer, and Hoofer, perform, that is going to be satisfying, right? It's going to be satisfying. It may make folks laugh. And what he was sort of indicating is that our senses of humor that we think are so sort of, that many people think is particularly liberatory or idiosyncratic, are curated, right? They're curated by a tradition that tells us to laugh at certain things. And, but then also there's just expert performance, which elicits particular responses for us. So when we think also about this bridge from blackface minstrelsy to latter iterations of African American comedic performance, that so often first Black audiences are shaped by these oppressive ideologies as well, right? They're not always in an oppositional stance, right? Sometimes they are, right? They definitely recognize that some of this stuff is deeply offensive, but they're not always in oppositional stance, even in the contemporary moment, right? And so not always an oppositional stance, but also a lot of the times, even when they are in an oppositional stance, right? And they're just like, oh, no, this is virulently racist. I'm not with this. They're responding to the performance, to gestural vocabulary, right? And to that dexterity. And that blends in, right? And in terms of styles of movement, bugging eyes, moving across the stage in particular ways. So that is part of that legacy that we still see in the Chitlin circuit. We still see that performances in blackface. We still see some of those routines, which in many respects were actually it's like watching a rerun of a sitcom. It could be really rewarding for an old black-faced minstrel bit for you to see on one of those rare occasions that you caught a stop of a duo that hit your town, right, on the Chitlin Circuit. That could be rewarding. So we still see it sort of lead into earlier moments in the 20th century through latter moments in the 20th century.
Well, thank you for that. We are here. I definitely want to make sure we talk about Redd Foxx. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about his time in particular in the 50s. But I want to start with, where did you come into contact with Redd Foxx?
Ooh, Redd Foxx. Oh, so it had to be reruns of Sanford and Son on television. So that was my first encounter with Redd Foxx. It was probably reruns of Sanford and Son, and right, him clutching his chest, right, that iconic gesture. And then I definitely remember hearing about sort of blue records or party records that we can discuss at greater length, but hearing about people like sneaking to listen to records. Like, I think this was a narrative in some, I've always been a follower of comedy. Even as a kid, I got to watch explicit comedy. My parents weren't I couldn't curse in the house, but I could watch anything. So I was watching Eddie Murphy Raw. Like, I saw that. My dad had the VHS. So I watched that. I watched everything. And I definitely remember, I don't remember which particular comedian, but them talking about sneaking to hear particular records. And so that the combination of the reruns, but then I also knew there was something that I didn't have access to yet, which were records that people were sneaking to listen to.
Well, I'd like to talk about the party records. Like, what is a party record? I know he was known as the king of the party record, but like, what actually is a party record?
So when we think about a party record, we're thinking about a record with blue. Sometimes we talk about blue material, and this is just frank talk about sexuality, maybe sort of explicit, maybe a little untoward, right? And we're seeing these circulate in the 50s in particular. And so Redd Foxx was called the king of the party records because his label, Do To Records, which is a Black-owned record label, the owner of that label went and recorded Redd Foxx one time and presented this idea that he could, sort of sell his records. And Redd Foxx agreed to it. He was a little bit suspicious. He didn't really know if anything would happen with that. But they sold like hotcakes. In fact, there were bootlegs that were circulating. Even bootlegs are circulating to the number of maybe 200,000. I mean, his records are really popular. And so Redd Foxx's record label will sometimes reuse old material. So some of these are like the party records are overlapping, but he produced a lot. But it's not just Redd Foxx. You have folks like the Jewish American comedian Belle Barth, and she sang, and she's based in, so many people are familiar with the Borscht Belt, right? Or the Jewish Alps, in which many Jewish comedians would perform, right? And many Jewish American families would vacation, go there and perform. And so Belle Barth is in sort of Borscht Belt South, right, in Florida. And that's where she performed at a lot of clubs, but also she released records. And so this is something, these sort of off-color records where there's frank talk about sexuality are circulating. Now for Redd Foxx, these are jokes primarily. For someone like Belle Barth, and for women broadly, because of the social construction of humor as a masculine practice, she's approaching it through an angle, right? So she's sort of singing because there's discomfort with women engaged in direct address comedy. We still see it today. This is why so many women comedians have to employ self-deprecation to get the audience to be comfortable with them being on the stage. But Redd Foxx is performing on these records, and there's all kinds of bits that he had. He had a bit called the Racetrack, right? And on that early record, I think it's Laugh of the Party from 1956, and on the Racetrack, one of the horses is named Dick. right? So then he'll be like on the laugh of the party, oh, my dick slipped, or my dick's never run as fast, or my dick got it by an inch, right? So when we think about also a raunchy or off-color record, I wanted to give you that context that in the contemporary moments, that's lightweight, right? It's relatively lightweight. But in 1956, that's very different. Then he also had this bit on also that first record, Laugh of the Party, Volume 1, about song plugging. And so think about Tin Pan Alley, you think about the music industry, song plugging was selling sheet music to stores or to record labels to get it sort of for people to purchase, or to sell it to a record label to get one of their performers to record it. So that was called a song plugger. So he has this thing about song plugging and about plugging songs, but the songs are all named after women. So I tried, I plugged Maria. That was nice. I plugged, Karen. They tried to get me to plug Jim, and that's when I quit, right? But chain, right? Being the joke that, a queer encounter was too far. So that's kind of the nature of some of his early material, these party records that are circulating, that people are listening to, adults. Party records that adults are listening to after the kids have gone to sleep, at get-togethers in the living room, sometimes in the basement, and just enjoying themselves. And the jokes are actually, the songs, they can kind of fit in rapid fire, sort of discrete. It's not sort of like a long narrative where you have to sort of be engaged. But they're bits that kind of can come in and out of conversation, and one can engage and feel a little, and it can feel fun and sort of a little bit illicit.
Well, I'm curious as to like what Red Fox was doing live, and was it the same or similar material as to what was on these records?
Yeah, it actually was. So Doo Doo Records, they would just go and record his sets. Right?
Okay.
So some of those records don't have the best audio quality. Some of them do. It just depends on where the recording material was set up. So yeah, these are where his live performances. He's not going into, live performances generally are recorded that way, but they're just going to his sets and recording.
And what kind of venues is he performing in, and other, artists like him at this point? Is it mostly club dates?
Yes, he's doing club dates, and he was dissatisfied with sort of his access. So when you think about 50s, they're mostly club dates, and these are Black clubs, right, that he's performing at. Once you start getting into the 60s and you have the emergence of some comedians, some Black male comedians who are about 10 years his junior, he sees them sort of leapfrog him slightly because they started to get access. You think about folks like Dick Gregory, think about Bill Cosby, right? You think about Godfrey Cambridge, right? These people are kind of leapfrogging him. They're getting access to integrated clubs. It took a while for Red Fox to have access to some of these clubs. So he's primarily performing in Black clubs. Sometimes he's opening for musicians. That's pretty frequent, or working the same bill as particularly jazz musicians.
Well, that brings us to, why we're interested in terms of the town hall, and that is that we found out that he opened for Nina Simone at her groundbreaking concert at the town hall. It was her debut. And she also came from like the club culture, and was, so sick and tired of people drinking while she performed. She's a classically trained pianist. So this was like her coming out party, her Deb ball. But to think that Nina Simone was being opened by Red Fox. I mean, the bill is kind of strange. Horace Silver, J.J. Johnson, and Red Fox, the king of the party records, is on this bill. And I was, I know that there was a deep relationship between him and Dinah Washington. But what was his relationship to other jazz artists?
So what's interesting is Horace Silver actually writes about his time performing on the New Jersey coast, Atlantic City, and one other city. I'm forgetting the other city. But Horace Silver, who's also on this bill, the pianist, one of my favorites, would perform at these summer resorts, and he'd be on the bill with Slappy White and Red Fox. So when Red Fox was in his comedic duo with Slappy White. So he'd be on the bill, and he writes in his autobiography about after his last set, he would go hear Red Fox and just laugh and have the best time, which started a long time sort of collegial relationship. Mm-hmm. Red Fox opened a club on La Cienega Boulevard in Los Angeles in the 60s, and Horace Silver was a regular there. He performed there. And this is just one of the many musicians that he worked with, in addition to being on a similar bill. So Red Fox, whether as a solo act or as a comedic duo, would be performing on the same bills as these jazz musicians. In addition, way back in Chicago, so Red Fox, of course, born John Elroy Sanford in St. Louis, but moves to Chicago, right? And goes to DuSable High.
Yeah.
At DuSable High, right? Dorothy Donegan, Gene Ammons are his classmates, both jazz musicians. He is, even though he drops out, he's able to be part of this music program that had produced so many jazz musicians. Another classmate, though not a jazz musician who is worth noting, is John H. Johnson of Ebony fame, right? A classmate at DuSable High. So we think about these from an earlier moment. He's also surrounded by musicians. He participated in the music program despite the fact that he wasn't in school. And he had formed a sort of washtub band. And this is a band that uses both conventional and homemade instruments with his classmates. He really started out as a musician. So in addition to being on the same bills as these musicians later on, this was something he was invested in. He was a nimble performer who was in both music, actually put out some recordings, music before he ever put out comedic recordings, put out musical recordings, and then pivots to comedy. So he's able to build these relationships, and also he has a deep investment in Black music practice.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that, people would stay after their own sets to hear him perform. And this is a review from the New York Herald Tribune about his night with Nina Simone and Horace Silver. And the quote that takes me out every time I read it is about how different he was than a typical town hall act. So Red Fox, a sharp, acid, and rather outspoken nightclub comedian, took a brief turn that would have startled the more typical town hall ticket buyer, and that left, for a fact, some of the hall's ushers gasping with astonishment and laughter. So you think about what the hall is like in 1959, and here's Red Fox. It was interesting. I was, for this, researching the Nina Simone show, I had spoken to some of her musicians who are still alive, and he couldn't remember that Red Fox was on the bill. He's like, are you sure it wasn't Godfrey Cambridge? Are you sure it wasn't, just because it seemed like such an odd match. He thought it was kind of, like the next generation of classed in some way comedians who had made it to integrated clubs, as you had said earlier. So, of course, we think about Richard Pryor and her relationship with him. But the idea of Red Fox, just sent him. He could not believe it.
I actually think they're a perfect match, right? So you think about, I think they work well together. Think about Nina Simone. When I think about Nina Simone's practice, I think of her unsettling the standard, both as a play on unsettling these standards that she's singing, right? Drawing from these great American songbooks and doing different work with them. Mm-hmm. That's really a result of her deep training, investment, and belief in Black musical principles, like call and response. So oftentimes we talk about call and response. Say it loud, we're Black and I'm proud. But also we talk about call and response. We're calling response through history. We're calling response to different moments, right? In Black music. So for her, to this call and response is playing with the standard is something that's really interesting, as well as improvisation. So we think about her unsettling standard, something like Mississippi Goddamn, that I think one could approach through the lens of humor, right? So we think about Mississippi Goddamn, we're thinking about, mid-60s, thinking about her composing this after the, white supremacist murders of Emmett Till and Medgar Evers and the bombing of the 4 little girls in Birmingham, right? And she chooses this song, right? From a musical theater idiom, right? The song gallops, there's this percussion and piano. And even in the lyrics, she said, doesn't she say this is for a show that hasn't been written yet? I think she said along those lines.
Yeah.
This is for a show that hasn't been written yet. And so we have her using a song that fits within the musical theater format. And remember that blackface minstrelsy is musical theater, right? So she's taking something, so she's strategically using a form which is used to advance and enforce, right, racial hierarchies, and flipping it and using it to be put her foot on the neck of, right, these hierarchies. Mm-hmm. So I think that's actually quite clever, right? I think it's quite clever. I think it's a little play on that, using a show tune. When you think about, oftentimes we think about humor and we think about how do we define or understand humor? There's one theory that thinks called the incongruity theory. It's about juxtaposing things that don't seem to belong together. Mm-hmm. Right? That's what she's doing there. So instead of thinking about it as just that which produces laughter in terms of humor, which is an insufficient definition, thinking about like what can humor mount and how does humor operate, right? And holding these things that are incongruent together. That's what's happening on Mississippi Goddamn. That's how she's playing with history. She's calling response. So I think that shock, right? That shock and astonishment, right, of the ushers and whatnot. I could see similar responses to the first time they heard Mississippi Goddamn. I think it's a perfect pairing.
Yeah, it actually is. I wonder what it would have been like for Red Fox to open for her at the Carnegie date when she debuted Mississippi Goddamn. I mean, what a sort of complete picture that would have been for an audience, But I'm really fascinated by the relationship between comedy and music. And you spoke a bit about Red Fox as an actual musician, but I think this is something we see not just with Red Fox. I mean, one of the first things I just mentioned, Carnegie, that I think of is, when great performers get to start going into these integrated concert halls to perform. So like a Moms Mabley. Well, this is a very young mom. She did not look like that when she went to Carnegie, but she's someone who absolutely had like very strong relationships to musicians. And I know this is often because shows used to be, there used to be variety shows. Like you would go to the Apollo and see several acts in one night that were, different mediums or different forms of performance. This, of course, is her with Pearl Bailey on Pearl Bailey's variety show. Could you speak just more about that? As somebody who of my age, I think about Eddie Murphy and the Fat Boys, or Dave Chappelle and the Block Party, or Richard Pryor and Patti LaBelle. Could you just give us a little something about comedians and musicians?
Yeah, so I think you touched on part of it. So part of it is that variety show format, which is the foundation of entertainment in the U.S., in which they're so often partnered, but also in which one has to be a well-rounded performer. So in earlier moments in African American, in Black comedic performance in the U.S., what we're seeing also are artists who have the dexterity in music. So as in the case of Red Fox, so there is this admiration to that extent, and so a lesser extent you have musicians who, if they have to, in terms of negotiating a crowd, have a facility with humor. I think about in jazz in particular, you can think about so many times in terms of quotations. When you're at a jazz show and you hear, let's say Robert Glasper. Many people are familiar with Robert Glasper. I'm a big fan. I was a big fan. I don't know if I say was or am. It's kind of both, sort of. But I really liked his trio work. So I like his more straight ahead work. I appreciate all expressions of jazz, but I like his straight ahead work. And so I think it's his second Bruno album. He has a song called FTB, which stands for explicit word, the, another explicit word. You can make that of what you will. And then I think I heard him perform, and then he quoted "Don't Sell Yourself to Fall in Love" by Slum Village, right? So if you have a song called FTB and then you have "Fall in Love" that you quote, it's actually a little bit of a joke, right? Don't fall in love with these things, right? So a lot of the practices of quotation actually are employing humor, right? So there is probably an admiration and participation in the same practice that is part of what coheres. But if we extend beyond jazz, I think it really has to do with devotion to Black creative practice and admiration for Black creative practice. And so I mentioned some of the principles of Black music we think about that have been articulated by Black musicologists like Holly Wilson and Eileen Southern. But we think about, course call and response. We also have this valorization of movement, right, to performance. And we think about competition and improvisation. So we think about all these principles, competition and improvisation, which are so fundamental to the development of an act, of a tight 10, tight 15, right? You are thinking about your act in relationship to other performers. Improvisation is necessary, certainly, because anything can happen in a nightclub act. One of the things that Red Fox is so good at, sometimes he's characterized as insult comedian. I might consider that a step too far, but he was very deft at dealing with hecklers. And at a couple of times he came to blows, but most of the time he handled them with wit, right? With a really, really quick wit. Just, you couldn't throw him off. And also being able to sort of just work, call and response throughout history, call back to an earlier moment in your set. So I think some of the principles that inform, right, comedic performance are also informing Black music making. And so I think there is this mutual admiration for those two things by performers.
Thank you. Something that I feel like keeps coming up is the vaudeville circuit, the Chitlin circuit. And I was wondering if you feel that there has been a continuation, like what does that look like today? Something that is not necessarily that, but that comes to mind is some of like very famous tours with multiple comedians on them, like Queens of Comedy, Kings of Comedy, stuff like that. But I was wondering where you feel that shows up today.
So I've been thinking about how you might call some of the social media circuits, consider them like sort of a modern Chitlin circuit. And before I advance it, I just want to say that sometimes when people say Chitlin circuit, and this is not how you're using it, and it's not how I'm using it, but I've heard people use it in a derogatory fashion, right? As if it's less than, right? So we think about Black vaudeville as being less than vaudeville. These are just different circuits, right? But because of, the investment in crossing over, so Black artists having access to white stages is about compensation, right? It's about compensation. You cross over, you can get in films and TV in which there's deep investment. Those resources are just not in Black communities, not for any deficiency, but we know because of structural issues, right? Talk about crossing over. Crossing over is about financial compensation. Crossing over is about production value, right? Which is a result of a greater investment in the product, right? That's about, we're not talking about anything more valuable. So I just want to say that first. When I say Chitlin circuit, I'm just talking about Black circuits. So Black social media circuits. So I think about some Black social media circuits on TikTok, YouTube as being sort of, maybe you could call them modern Chitlin circuits. So some of the people that I'm thinking about, I think this one, Mark Phillips, think he just signed a deal, maybe with I don't know. I can't remember, but I know he just signed a deal. But he does short sketches. He's on YouTube. His handle is Supreme Dreams _1 on Twitter. And then he's RDC World 1 on YouTube. And so Mark Phillips is known for different sketches that he mounts with some of his colleagues. And so one is about like sort of a bodyguard who is scared of everyone. It's just like, let's go this direction. A bodyguard who doesn't want to protect his client. And he had a viral one about LeBron James, of course, the LA Lakers superstar, who is just getting some shots up. He gets a call, and this would have been over the off season. He gets a call that James Harden has joined the Brooklyn Nets, right? So now he knows it's a new super team because already Kyrie had joined, already KD was there, Kevin Durant was there. And so he's just like, what? And he's just, I can't believe it. He calls Kyrie. So it's just LeBron losing it and saying, I'm 36. And sort of a play. And that's actually interesting call and response, because there is this this clip that circulates about this comedian, another social media circuit comedian, modern day Chitlin circuit comedian, who says you're 36 to someone who is conducting themselves in a sort of immature way. So we have that. Those are some of the sort of things that Mark Phillips does. Then we have somebody who I love right now, who I might consider to be on this, because it's also traveling Black social media circuits, which doesn't mean it doesn't have access to the wider public in the contemporary moment versus an earlier moment. You know, social media, sort of everybody has access, but things that are particularly popular with Black social media users is Shay Moore from Arkansas. Her handle is Obey, OBEYY _MONAEE. I'm all about citation, right? So people can find people. But when we think about Shay Moore, young woman from Arkansas, she has these short sketches on Black family life. So mom waking, a recent one that was hilarious, I think she shared it just a few days ago, well, just maybe yesterday, was a mom waking up kids to clean up after 4th of July, right? She has one where it's a parent-teacher conference, and she's on TikTok as well. And how long it takes Black folks to leave a house, you know, Black folks say, all right, we gonna head out. And then they're there for 3 or 4 hours. So those types of things. And then you could actually, and the last person I'll mention is, you could also maybe argue Issa Rae as well as part of this. When you think about her start on YouTube and Awkward Black Girl, of course, Awkward Black Girl had a wide audience, but it was Black folks, particularly Black women, who were all up supporting that, right? So that was another circuit who talked about it, who circulated, who were excited about it. And so that's another circuit, example of maybe a contemporary Chitlin circuit, another example of someone's on that. But I think it's happening on social media.
Everyone download TikTok. It's my favorite app now. Something I've been thinking about, and I know that you're teaching about, is physical comedy and like skills-based comedy. Like, can you really fall down? You know what I mean? Like, can you do sort of like the basic comedy tricks? And, you know, I came of age in the 90s. So I felt like there was an abundance of that because of Martin Lawrence. I mean, the whole cast really of Martin and some of the other sitcoms. Can you speak about physical comedy over time, but especially now? Like, who now is really doing that skill-based comedy?
So physical comedy gets a bad rap. And part of the reason that it gets a bad rap, particularly part of the reason it gets a bad rap is this separation of like physicality and movement from intelligence, right? And there is some important work being done on many different fronts that sort of pushes back at that. I really like the work of Kira Gaunt, who is an ethnomusicologist. I think she's at SUNY Albany. But she wrote a book that I love. I love to teach it. I think it's amazing. It's called The Games Black Girls Play. That's about double dutch and hand clapping games and all that good stuff. It's really thinking about this sophisticated musical practice and innovation and all the things that are happening there. But one of the arguments that she makes there is one of the reasons that people don't take seriously, you know, Black girls games and double dutch is of like movement. Right? We don't think about movement as being intelligent, right? So people don't take that seriously. And so part of this has to do with this idea that this is like a lower form. And sometimes people, and even we were talking before this got started, even the idea of like heady comedy, right, suggests that, and even when people just mean it's sort of cerebral, but I like to move away from that idea of something being heady and something being not heady, right? Some people are using their bodies and some people are not, right? So the challenge is this idea that physical comedy is less than, that it's buffoonery, that it's clownery. Now, particularly in Black comedic traditions, because Black folks in the US were cast as part of one of the stereotypes used to oppress us, cast as clowns, and sometimes forced to clown for white audiences, there also sometimes is this resistance, can be this resistance, or this idea that one is trying to transcend having to move, or that's a throwback to earlier moments in time. Mm. So that is one of the challenges that faces it. But both of those things, the idea that it's sort of less intelligent, right? And then the idea that it's clownery, and it's sometimes people even think it's coonery. But when we think about the skillfulness, like let's think about sketch comedy and go back and then move forward. We think about In Living Color, the gift of folks like Tommy Davidson, who I mentioned earlier, Takia Crystal Kima. The gift for those comedians is that they were tremendously nimble. Even Jamie Foxx, right? They could contort their faces. They could move their bodies. Many of them have really astounding voices. They could do all these things, which allowed them the flexibility to adopt all sorts of different roles and guises to mount so many images. If we go to another sketch comedy show, what is that woman's name? Deborah.
Oh my God. Yes, from Mad TV. Yes. Deborah.
Deborah Wilson. Oh, Jesus. Deborah Wilson.
Yes.
One of the most skilled physical comedians, right? Being able to assume different characters. One of my favorites, Tasheena Arnold, amazing physical comedian. We think about her work, not only on Martin, but Everybody Hates Chris, the way she moves her body. The effectiveness of her comedic practice, of her as a comedic actor, is the ability of that movement. When you think about when Biggie was on there, Notorious B.I.G. made that, and then she does all this. Like, it's not just what she says, but it's how she moves, right? There's so many moments where it's how she moves, or when her and Tisha Campbell's character are in these contests and how they're moving. All of this stuff is what is elevating the work and making it sing. And sometimes I watch some contemporary sketch comedy shows and I'm like, I don't think that the actors may be good writers, they may be decent actors, but sometimes I think they're deficient in the physical comedy. Like they haven't invested enough in that. And that's why it's not working. Like, I'm like, you need to move. Also, think about that episode, the singing ability, going back to music. Think about that episode of Martin when Varnell Hill is on there and on the radio and Varnell Hill is singing. It's Tommy Davidson who plays the Varnell Hill. Like being able to sing, right? Eddie Murphy too, being able to sing at moments. That's what's selling it. So I'd like to see, I don't know that we see the same investment. Now, what we are seeing right now, think about some physical comedians that I do enjoy. I see them on social media. Some have made the jump. So I'm not sure if I'm saying, is it Quinta Brunson or is it Quinta Brunson?
I think it's Quinta.
Quinta, thank you.
I think it's Quinta.
That wrong. So apologies for mispronouncing her name. But so she just came out with this memoir, right? Which is and that's the thing. All the successful social media comedians get the book deal. Good for them. Another stream of income. So the title of it is She Means Well, right? And so now it's so appropriate because she, one of her skills, right? Skills, not gifts. One of her skills in those social media bits, right? Where it's just like, oh, he got money, right? Remember those viral ones? I think they were on Vine, maybe. He got money. Those, and then when she had that Facebook show that was really excellent,
Yeah.
Facebook show, and now she's doing voices. She's crossed over, right? And she's getting greater compensation. But one of her skills is in her acting to create these memes. And she said this in an interview about when she had her Facebook show. And I think for folks who are viewing, you can look at it's still on. You can still watch her old show. I forgot what it's called. You can still watch her old show on Facebook. But her acting practice was her expressions would be made for Mimi. And that was part of her craft. So to me, that's a new form of physical comedy. How do I make sure that my performance can create memes? I think that is just brilliant. Same thing, I really like Bowman Martinez-Reed. He's on TikTok, a Canadian, Black biracial Canadian performer who does expert physical comedy. And part of it is sort of riffing on, he does these sort of spoofs of reality TV. But his work is great. Sorry. His work is great. And so those are some of the physical comedians that I'm really appreciating right
now. We have a question, just to take it back to Red Fox for a minute. Malcolm X mentions that he and Red worked together dishwashing before they became public figures. Any thoughts that either of them might have had an effect on the other person at that time? And I'll add onto that and ask about the uses of comedy and activism. And like, was Malcolm X funny? Which we have heard he was, from people who knew him.
So this is a good question. So thanks for this question. But so I'll talk about just the influence. I think I like that the way the question is framed, because I was thinking about the influence they might have had on each other, not just Malcolm or Malik El-Shabazz to Red Fox. I like to think about how Red Fox's influence on Malcolm X. I like to think about that in sort of cutting his teeth, refining his humorous sensibilities, and think about how he was sort of taking this in and using it to develop his practice that he'd employ when he would deliver speeches. So we know that Red Fox was Chicago Red, Malcolm was Detroit Red. And, they sometimes slept on rooftops, on newspapers together, and they worked together as dishwashers, all of that. So I'm thinking just one of the things about Red Fox is just so quick-witted. And so I like to think about how that might have impacted the rhetorical style of Malcolm X. As related to that, one of the things, and this is not a novel observation on my end, people have observed this before, but I don't think people spend enough time thinking about it. And I do. It is part of my book project. But let's talk about Sojourner Truth, right? Sojourner Truth, right? As she's advocating early Black feminists, as she's advocating, when she's working against patriarchy, dismantling patriarchy and other forms of oppression, dismantling racism. One of her strengths was her use of humor in her speeches. And there is, I think, it's right there in the text, and it's been observed by some scholars. And I think more time should be spent to that. Thinking about how this is, for me, the way that I read it, is a strategic tool. Both in terms of capturing the attention of every audience. So that's of course she's going to use humor to entertain and capture their attention. But how can she capture the experiences of Black womanhood? And I think she's strategically using humor, this ability to contain incongruities, to mount the experiences of Black womanhood. Right? She's saying this is actually the most appropriate mode that can capture what I'm experiencing and what I'm sort of trying to push against, at the same time as pushing, as entertaining this audience. So we have Sojourner Truth who used it. We know that in we think about homiletics, African American sermonic tradition, that pastors sometimes who are double activists often use humor in their sermons. So this is something that's there. I think sometimes the resistance if we ever see a resistance to engage or sometimes to overlook, is the assumption that if you highlight the humor or if you spend time laughing at it, that you're not taking someone seriously.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the idea that humor is frivolous. And I mean, I get it. I think sometimes people are like, this is what you want to spend your time researching. Humor, it just seems so light, right? And frivolous, right? Why is it meaningful? But this is a way that we make meaning, right? This is a way we make meaning. This is a way to express ideas. And this might be a way to amplify or air ideas, feelings that have been silenced in other realms where there's not space in other realms. So I definitely, the use of humor in, you know, in politics and in speech is something that's certainly been present in the experiences of Black people in the US.
Thank you for that. We've got a great question that takes us in a direction that I wanted to go into. Elisa's asking, can you talk about other party record comics like Rudy Ray Moore? And I would ask that you address it also when we're talking about the development of the Black comedic movie star. Rudy Ray Moore, I mean, the callback that Eddie Murphy is making by making this film, Dolomite, but also in the context of Red Fox, who from the Chitlin circuit, from the party records, kind of goes to the mountaintop.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about party records, but I do want to talk about the mountaintop because when Red Fox gets on Sanford and Son, right? So we know he had been working and he was seeing his career being leapfrogged by this generation. Well, not really a generation. They're only 10 years younger. The thing about Red Fox is he always seemed older than he was. I think he has one of those faces like the actor from Lovecraft Country. Like it just has got a lot of experience in it. And as well, like just kind of in his styling, right? I think that just sort of aged. But he's only really 10 years older of Cosby and Gregory and whatnot. But he saw them leapfrog him. So he was working, and I don't want to say necessarily in the trenches, but he wasn't getting the compensation that he wanted. And that's the struggle. Like, how do you make your living? And crossing over allows for that. So, you know, Dick Gregory, Bill Cosby, Godfrey Cambridge are making so much more money than he is. So there was that challenge. And then by the time he gets Sanford and Son, his treatment by the network was not ideal, right? So we know that he and I'm forgetting the name of the actor, but the actor who plays Lamont, both didn't report to set for a long time because of the treatment, both in terms of they wanted better compensation. They wanted better dressing rooms, which were not comparable to other stars. Many of the things that we have heard, that we continue to hear about Black people's experience on set, Black actors on set, not having, maybe you have someone who has a less significant role, they have a trailer, you have to share a trailer, right? We still see these things today. So I just wanted to say that, like, Red Fox's career, although he had this, that show, he was still deeply challenged. And Della Reese, the comedian and singer who was a good friend of Red Fox for many years, she has said, and it's mentioned in his biographer mentions it, and one thing she said is just that the network insulted his intelligence on a regular basis.
Ooh.
That I just wanted to make sure that we, like, there's no mountaintops here for there's no mountaintops here for Black performers, right? It's always a challenge, even with that success. Oftentimes comes compromises, even when they don't want to. We have someone like Richard Pryor, who in '77, he had the special variety show, then he had the variety show, and he quit because the network NBC was trying to exercise too much creative control. Like, there's always, and Richard Pryor, of course, legend, always right in struggle with these networks, always in struggle with the industry. But thinking about other party records, I'm not going to talk about Rudy Ray Moore. I'm going to talk about Luanda Paige. Right. You know, I've got to lift the voice of women here. And partly it's just I don't really enjoy Rudy Ray Moore. I think Luanda Paige is a little bit more entertaining. But I know Rudy Ray Moore is on folks' minds particularly because of that documentary. And then there's the those films. I will say this quickly about Rudy Ray Moore. You know, it's like maybe my dad had me watch all types of comedy, but I did not watch any of Rudy Ray Moore films. And He didn't have us watch it. That was like a little too far. We saw the Mac, we saw all this stuff. He was like, "I'm gonna teach you about blaxploitation, this whole thing." That's just part of, your education, the education you experience outside of school. But we watch Reader more, and I think that was just a little too far. He was like, "That's not appropriate for little girls." Like, show them this. So I didn't watch those growing up. I watched them later. But Luanda Paige is another party record person, and she is appropriate to mention because I mentioned earlier that she went to grade school with Red Foxx in St. Louis. But another thing about Luanda Paige, who played Aunt Esther on Sanford and Son, is she put out a lot of party records on Laugh Records, right? And so these other party records, and Luanda Paige is actually, it's a bit more, I have to say a bit more suggestive, right? There's just more frank talk about sex and sexuality, right? And more explicit talk. Like, she has one bit on an album. I'm trying to remember the name of the tune. She's this one bit where she's talking about the prowess of a man, right? She has a whole bit where she talks about that. She talks about kids with foul language kids. There's a lot of talk about sex. There's talk about being on relief. And so Luanda Paige had all of that. And I think it's interesting when you think about party records, particularly the frank sex talk, I think allows us to think about what it means and how we receive when Black performers, particularly Black comedic performers, are engaging in conversations about sex, right? One of the things that Red Foxx said earlier in his career was that, like, he was just really upset about the fact that so many people would sort of pass on him when he was trying to cross over because he talked about sex. He was like, it's like, I'm an adult, I can talk about sex. So his quote was, I found it, his quote to one of his friends was, "They won't let me get on TV because I talk about sex." Well, Black folks have sex. There you go. So part of the party records is airing something because of the stereotypes of Black men being bucks and Black women being Jezebels, is sometimes that becomes muted. Muted in our history, particularly for Black women. We talked about when we add on that specter of sexual violence that has informed Black women's experience in the U.S. and even prior to the U.S. from the kidnapping on Africa, right? So we have sexual violence, and we also just have sex and pleasure and choice. But Black folks do have sex. And I really appreciate Red Foxx saying this, like, why do I have to not talk about sex? Because Marsha Warfield, who's a comedian in the 1970s, who I spend a lot of time thinking about, who I've interviewed, and whose work has been really influential. Marsha Warfield, who, for those, some people may know her as being a cast member on Nightclub, but it's really important to remember or to learn that her CV is astounding. It's next level, right? She won the San Francisco International Comedy Competition in 1979, actually the only woman to have ever won. And other people who competed in various early San Francisco International Comedy competitions include Dana Carvey and Robin Williams, right? So these are the type of competitors. She was on the main stage at the Comedy Store, that important club in Los Angeles that launched so many careers, Jay Leno, etc. And women were often banished to another room, the belly room. Whoopi Goldberg never made it on the main stage, right, in those early years. So she was booked on all types of TV shows. In the late 1970s, she didn't even have an agent. So her CV is astounding. She had her own talk show. So her CV is absolutely astounding. And one of the things that Marsha Warfield also said, because her album came out in 1981 called I'm a Virgin, also on Laugh Records. She's frank talk about sex, masturbation, penis size, all the other stuff. And she was like, I'm an adult. Why can't I talk to other adults about sex? And so I want to bring Angela Davis into this conversation, because one of the things she says in her discussion of blues women and blues legacies, Black feminisms, is that enslaved Black people did not have control of their sexuality. So one of the most important exercises of freedom is the exercise to choose your partners, right? To choose your partners, to have sex. This is not something that's determined by someone else. So why can't people sing these songs of freedom or talk these songs of freedom or have bits that discuss it? So I think when we returning to this notion of the party records, I think the significance too is sometimes you hear really frank and funny and irreverent talk about sex that may be missing in other elements of, or a bit more muted in other elements of Black pop culture.
Thank you. We've got some questions coming in. One from Summer Islander. Have you ever read Foxx B.S. Before Sanford? It seems to be the closest thing to his autobiography.
I have not read that. I'll show you what I have read, but I've heard about that one. So what I read was this one, Black and Blue, the Red Foxx story, which is, I mean, it's comprehensive. And at moments like, there are moments when the author, I mean, it's comprehensive, it's good. There's moments when the author sometimes is like sort of explaining the racism of someone else, right? So sort of, oh, I don't think they meant it that way. And I'm like, I don't know about that. But otherwise, I think it's good. So thanks for that. Thanks for that. I mean, I've heard about Before Sanford, but since you really enjoyed it, I'm going to add that and make sure that I fill out the Red Foxx, my Red Foxx reading list. But I've read that one. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, I encountered this really early. This is the Red Foxx Encyclopedia of Black Humor. And really early in my research on Black women humorists, I encountered this because I was just reading everything on Black folks in comedy. But what's really valuable about this is it's supposedly authored by Red Foxx, but it's not, right? But he shares the byline with Norma Miller, a Black woman who was his longtime friend and was a comedian and dancer. And so that's another, when you think about resource, I think it's telling. This Red Foxx Encyclopedia of Black Humor came out in 1977, I think. Yeah, 1977. What's really valuable is it wasn't Red Foxx's idea. Somebody approached him with it. But the fact that he understood in 1977, he lended his name, right? He knew that lent his name. He knew that would help sell the project, brought in Norma Miller, right? Gave her an opportunity to craft this history. So we have this Black woman who is writing this history of Black humorists in the US, and who was a friend of Red Foxx. And she actually appears as well. Some of her humor appears in Honey Hush, an anthology of African-American women's humor by Daryl Cumberdance, which is an essential read. I believe it's out of print, but I think you could probably get a used copy somewhere so you can see some of the work of Norma Miller. But I think it's such a valuable and so telling about Red Foxx because he was invested in getting some of this history down, and advocating and sort of allowing for someone and providing an opportunity for someone, particularly a Black woman, to be able to tell this story. So yeah, that's also part of sort of the Red Foxx reading list.
Well, before we exit Marcia Warfield, what drew you initially to her and her work?
So I'm obsessed with the 70s. That's like a personal thing. I love the 70s. I think the 70s are a great moment in music, but also the 70s is a really important moment in Black women's cultural production and Black feminist thought. Right. So we see when we think about the 70s and Black feminist thought, the Combahee River Collective is meeting, right? They publish their statement in which they begin early on. There have always been Black women activists, right? And they name some and they say there's thousands whose names we don't know, which is so important because I'm going to connect that to the fact that in that early moment when I couldn't find any Black women humorists, I knew there had always been Black women humorists. And it's important for me to say this out loud because in your own searches, sometimes I find people who are in their own searches for a Black woman who does this or Black woman who does that. Because they don't find someone, they think they didn't exist. We have been omitted from the historical record. Of course, a lot of times it's actually not shocking that we don't find people. But we can never buy into the fact that because we're outside the historical record or the books are out of print and you can't find it, that we don't exist. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make logical sense that we wouldn't participate in that. And still with this history of Black feminist thought. So Combahee River Collective's meeting. You think about Black women writers. Louis Dye published in 1970. We have books by Toni K. Bambara. We have books by Alice Walker. So it's this It's this moment. It's a Black women's literary renaissance. We have this happening in terms of Black feminist thought. It's this really critical moment. And I was interested in cohering that to what's happening elsewhere. So what we also have just really productive moments in Black women's music. So thinking about Betty Davis and Millie Jackson, who are two artists that I also write about, who employ humor and are reverent and talk about sex, right? So this is happening at the same time. And then we also have Marsha Warfield. So I wanted to put them in conversation. I want to put writers in conversation with musicians, in conversation with performers. What happens when we convene Black women who employ humor, right? And think about what can be generated, and think about making, thinking about practice. Say, okay, how is this Black woman using humor? How is this Black woman using humor? How is this Black woman using humor? Because so often, in terms of how we approach humor, we have a work of humor, and then the comparison is a continental philosopher or a white theorist. So people take Freud to make sense of Whoopi Goldberg, or they use Bakhtin to make sense of Whoopi Goldberg, right? What many women, and not folks who focus on Black women, folks who focus on women humorists have said, many of these theorists didn't even think women had the capacity for humor, but we're using them as our interpretive devices. So part of what Marsha Warfield is, I wanted to be able to think, I wanted to understand humor, Black women's relationship to humor, Black womanhoods, how Black womanhood is marshaled in humor, and how Black women negotiate the fact that in the American comedic tradition, that the force, I'm going to quote, paraphrase Eric Lott here, but the force of the disdain for Blackness is concentrated on Black womanhood and Blackface minstrelsy. And that bleeds into the entertainment industry. We see that continue. So what can happen if I think about all these? So that's why I interviewed Millie Jackson. I interviewed Marsha Warfield. Anybody has a hookup to interview Betty Davis, let me know. I'd love to interview her. I don't know. I don't think there's been a Black woman who's interviewed her in this kind of like in this the pieces. And I think it would be different. Not saying that I'm like some great person, but so many of the interviews are sort of objectifying. Ooh, you were a big freak. You used to whip him with a turquoise chain, right? It's like, okay, I think another approach would be good. But for Marsha, part of it was her popularity. Part of it was also trying to think about comparative engagements of humor. But also, in watching her humor, I wasn't hearing or seeing deprecation. I was like, oh no, self-deprecation. I wasn't hearing her trading in stereotypes. And then you'll see them on stage, they're kind of floundering, and they're skillful women comedians. And then they'll just make a joke about how they need to lose weight. Oh, the audience will just go crazy, right? So I was seeing her not do this, and I was like, how is she successful without having to do the things that these other women are doing? And this is something that not just I've observed. Yael Cohen has an oral history of women comedians, and her colleagues in the 70s were like, how is Marsha Warfield doing it? Like, the audience was not bullying her, right? She wasn't falling victim. And so I was interested in investigating a practice in which the audience wasn't moving her, she was moving the audience, which is relatively rare in terms of comedians across the board. But for Black women is necessary, or else the audience is going to push you to engage in traffic and stereotypes, right? They're going to want you to produce what they expect. And so I saw a really sophisticated practice, and I wanted to spend more time thinking through it and understanding it.
Well, we've covered a lot, but I want to contextualize Marsha Warfield a little bit. And I was wondering if Moms Mabley is important in sort of that lineage, or at least the development of Marsha's own craft. And then we also have a question about Auntie Tina Dixon. I know we already sort of talked about Luanda Paige, but a couple of other really important Black female comedians.
Yeah. So when you think about Marsha Warfield, there's a great piece in Jet magazine from the 70s, where, and I talk about it in my journal article on Moms Mabley, I think, but where Marsha Warfield said, she just wanted to be, if she could be Marsha Warfield's, Moms Mabley chauffeur, that would be great. She just wanted to have access to her. So this impact, she was somebody who Marsha Warfield looked up to, and she was this North Star for many Black women comedians for a couple of reasons. First, we see this pivot in stand-up comedy from sort of more comedic duos and sketches to what is sometimes called direct address comedy, which stand-up comedy falls into. So the fact that you can engage the audience, right? You're directly addressing the audience. You're not in a costume. It's not gimmicky. And that's where you get to your sort of modern stand-up comedy, where you're not costumed, you're not talking to a partner, but you're talking straight to the audience. And because of this social construction of humor as a masculine practice, it's been very difficult for women across the board to access. Oftentimes women comedians had to sing and alternate between singing and maybe slipping in a joke or incorporate the jokes into their songs or dance. But there was very limited access to the stage to directly address an audience. So Mom is Jackie Moms-Mabley was a person who was able to do this. And so it's tremendously remarkable. And of course it has its influence on Marsha Warfield in particular. But one thing that I think is really valuable to note, and Whoopi Goldberg observes this in the documentary on Moms-Mabley, that she had to crowdfund for. I'm just gonna pause there for a moment. Crowdfund. Funniest woman in the world, million-selling records, long-standing history from the Chitlin circuit to a crossover later in life. And it wasn't until relatively recently we get a documentary. It has to be crowdfunded. So that also lets you know how sort of overlooked and under-engaged the humor of Black women is, right? That someone like Moms-Mabley the documentary has to be crowdfunded by Whoopi Goldberg, who used to, as she says in the documentary, used to do Moms. She used to do performances in Moms. So, but one thing that Whoopi Goldberg observes in the documentary is that Moms-Mabley had to be costumes. So unlike some comedians who could take the stage herself, Moms-Mabley, when she was a relatively young woman, was dressed as a grandmother, right? She had a costume. So even when she's a young woman, she's dressed as a grandmother. And part of that is what we see in terms of strategic negotiations that women comedians, Black women comedians in particular, have to do, is to make herself seem less threatening to an audience. Mm-hmm. Right? And so Whoopi Goldberg's important. It's so important that she notes this in there, that she's in a costume, right? She's not able to take the stage as herself. And one of the things that Marsha Warfield said in my interview with her was that she wanted to take the stage as herself. She didn't want to be anybody else. Be a stereotype. But she also didn't want to adopt any sort of other persona. And one of the things that was exciting to her with the sort of what she calls this revolution that people observed in 70s comedy, we see a shift in the 50s, folks like Mort Saul, who have a more conversational style, less sanitized, less mannered. Mort Saul being a Jewish American comedian. We see a pivot there, but we see, of course, Dick Gregory, and we see Bill Cosby. But in the 70s with, there's this sort of new breed of comedian, and then there's an opening up of possibility, right? And she wanted to be a part of that. She wanted to take the stage of herself. So while she admired Moms, she didn't want to have to make the same concessions as Moms. So she developed a practice that would allow for her to do that. Now, the challenge is you have somebody else like Denitra Vance, the first Black woman SNL repertory player. Denitra Vance talks about just really, she makes the decision that she's not going to fight with audiences, right? The audiences kept trying to move her and project onto her. And I mean, that was not a fight that she was interested in engaging in. As many of you who are familiar with Denitra Vance's output, she did some one-woman shows. She appeared at The Public. I mean, she has other work outside of her work on SNL. But she pivoted away from stand-up on purpose because of limitations. Another woman that I've interviewed, Jane Galvin Lewis, who was active a little bit later, early 80s in New York, talks about the challenges she faced at stand-up and is even uncomfortable with calling herself a stand-up, even though that's what she's doing. She calls herself a character comedian. And then circling back to Whoopi, Whoopi says in the documentary, she's like, well, I'm not really a stand-up. I'm sort of a Lena. And that is so instructive because this is Whoopi. This is EGOT Whoopi, who at this stage in her career, and this is, I don't know, maybe, when did that film come out? A decade ago, maybe a little bit less? Was uncomfortable with claiming stand-up, right? What does that say about the crafting of the narrative about stand-up and who counts as a stand-up comedian? So while we have this history of Moms Mabley, Marsha Warfield wanted to be able to take the stage as herself. She didn't want to make the concessions, and she didn't want to necessarily have to use characters, which was another avenue of entry that Black women were using. And some wanted to use characters, but some felt like they had to. And she wasn't going to do that. So part of the bridge is this great admiration, but also, okay, I'm at a moment, can I make more space? But one of the things that I want to just make sure I'm clear on in terms of Marsha Warfield, that there's no disparagement of Moms Mabley, just a recognition that that's something else that Moms Mabley was doing, and she didn't want to do the same thing, although she admired much of her practice. Now, another thing that Marsha Warfield did say was that there was a different historical moment, right? And I think the 70s, particularly when you put this in conversation with other sorts of Black feminist activism and agitation, was really this opening up of possibility. Well, not necessarily an opening up, this wedging open possibility, because the possibility don't open on itself, right? These are Black women who were wedging open possibility to be able to realize their visions, mount their comedic visions. So I'm not super familiar with Auntie Tina Dixon at all, so I can't speak to that. So sorry to the rest.
No, this has been such a journey tonight, starting with this concert, where it's kind of a bill you wouldn't necessarily think of, or at least definitely the reviewers at the time didn't think of. But from the offshoot of Red Foxx, he just seems like such an interesting figure to go off of into all these different directions. We're talking Chitlin Circuit, we're talking the party records, we're talking television, we're talking what he was able to do that women weren't necessarily able to do. We're talking the relationship between comedians and musicians, and we're talking about the limitations that still exist. So, I mean, I thank you so much. First of all, I have to say, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Equal Essien brings up Miss Shirlene.
Oh, yes.
As a character who I love and find so interesting. And I think that comment probably came around the time of talking about Moms Mabley and the costume, or the use of the costume to move a character or to create a character.
Shout out to Equa, amazing filmmaker as well. Amazing filmmaker. So that's a good point. I had forgotten her, but she is so skillful. Also, when we talked about the physical comedians, a nimble comedian, she can sing, and she moves. She's remarkable. But then there's also that's their side, because it's like that Christian comedy.
Yeah.
Right? Other sort of offshoot. So we've been talking about more sort of irreverent comedy, but then there is this whole sort of Christian comedy circuit. And what's remarkable about her career is that she's got the Christian comedy crowd, but she also has like a larger crowd. It's not Christian.
Yeah, I think Kev on Stage and that Chick Angel are also doing that, like comedy that is wide, but has very specific Christian quotes and callbacks and all of that, and definitely comes out of a Christian, I don't even know what the upbringing, but also Christian comedy. Yeah. And so it's something else that I think about in terms of Black comedy is the relationship to church language.
Yes.
And also tons of comedy being about what happens in the church, and even thinking about like Medea misquoting Bible passages, but that being completely understood, by the audience. Yeah, I think that's a whole other conversation that we could have, is just Black Christian humor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the fact, I will say just one quick comment on that humor. I think obviously for humor to work, you've got to get the references, right? So I'm not invested, and I don't advocate to these like ideas of like ethnic humor, like women's humor, right? Black women's humor. I mean, those are every person mounts their creative vision in the way that they want to. And it really flattens out in what they do when you say that it's just part of a particular category. People are doing different things. Right? What it makes it the way to understand it, the way that it works, is to get the references.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that we're incentivized, and I say we, and I'm judicious in my use of we, because it's like I'm always thinking when people are saying we, who is we? Right? But literally, we as audiences in the United States are incentivized to understand some humor, right? If this is constantly what sitcoms are on sitcoms, then you have to become familiar with the references, right? And I think I see that in Black communities, right? Black communities are very different because, of course, they're not everyone's Christian. And part of this is that even when people aren't Christian, because Black churches have often served as sort of community centers and activism, that didn't have to be Christian to be fluent, right? Church culture.
Yeah.
But they're also, I think, and I've sort of been observing, I grew up in church. I grew up in the oldest Black church in the Pacific Northwest. But I've also, there's like almost an enforcement, right? You want to be able to laugh, get familiar, right? Even if that's not your own faith tradition. So I think in the same way, not in the exact same way, because I don't think it's as sort of oppressive, but in the ways that sometimes, because the dominance of particular rhetorics and narratives, that one is incentivized to get familiar with something, even if it's outside of one experience, so that you can laugh too.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that, because I feel like on TikTok and on Twitter, I've had to up my fluency of like Somali woman humor, which includes understanding some Arabic words that I don't know, or, a little bit more about Islam. Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it, the fluency. And just one more thing, I was thinking about, sorry to go back to Medea again, but Medea's family reunion, I think it's called, when the abused woman, gets her hands on the pot of grits, and the opening bass line or guitar lick, excuse me, of Love and Happiness comes on, and you get it, you know exactly what this is talking about. If
Yes,
what's going to happen if you know the combination of those things and what they signify, but that requires fluency. I'm so excited by this conversation. I'm wondering what's next. Like, what do we have to look forward to?
Yeah, so I am at work. So there's the book project that I've been, we had the seeds as a child, but it's called Capacity for Laughter, Black Women in the American Comedic Tradition. And I'm examining humor, right, from different areas. I'm looking at literary humor. I'm looking at cartoonists. I'm looking at musicians. I'm looking at politicians, and we're thinking about how Black women are using humor. Looking at uses of humor carefully, generatively, and I'm attending to the worldviews that they mount. So I'm letting the humor lead me as a sort of applying these outside theories to that humor. And that looking is really recognizes that Black women have often observed and documented humor at work in their creativity when other communities haven't, right? When the large world hasn't, has been omitted. And it takes its title, and I think this is a good way to sort of speak to the larger part. It takes the title from the multi-hyphenate Toni Cade Bambara, right? Filmmaker, novelist, short story writer, teacher. People know her as the anthologizer behind The Black Woman. People may know her from The Salt Eaters, right? She's been a great revisited in this moment. You think about that opening line that I always have to call, right? I always have to call. I'm gonna say it right now. Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? That's the opening line. But when you think about Toni Cade Bambara, she was hilarious, right? She's hilarious. Toni Morrison was her editor, and Toni Morrison would talk about this. Daryl Cumberdance, who's the editor of Honey Hush, the anthology of African American women's humor, is talked about how Toni Cade Bambara's work had to be in her anthology. It was absolutely the center, the cornerstone, right? So this work, these short stories, and so many elements, she's employing humor in such sophisticated fashion. So Toni Cade Bambara, in an interview in the 1980s, said that the tremendous capacity for laughter in her work was often overlooked. And that's why I'm looking at Black women's uses of humor. Because we see this with Toni Cade Bambara, but we see it with so many other Black women artists. Sometimes are creative. Some of them are humorous, and some are creatives who use humor strategically here and there.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to look closely at that, where people have often looked away or tried to shadow them or silence them. And I'm going to look closer at that. So I'm continuing to work on that. And then I'm working on a journal article on this amazing woman that I encourage you all to look into. Her name was Arabelle Thompson. And she was a staff writer for Ebony and then international editor for Ebony magazine. And this is someone who was writing humor magazines in the 1920s. So I'm working on that. Right. So what's so interesting is so many people think about a humor magazine, right? And a Black women's humor magazine. This is not a new thing. It's not a new thing. Arabelle was on this. Arabelle Thompson was on this in the 20s, okay? So part of it is uncovering and bringing our attention back to the fact that these Black women have been doing this. And so I'm working on something on her humor magazines that she was writing by hand back then.
Well, I look forward to that, and I know everyone here will too. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation. I've learned so much. I'm going to have to rewatch just to get the Instagram handles of all these people that you mentioned. So for everybody who needs to do it as well, this will be up for a while. Come back tomorrow, whenever, to catch some of the things that Jalylah talked about. I want to thank everyone at the Town Hall, the team that made this possible. Jeff and Alex, our producer. We do this together as a team. So thank you to them, and thank you to the entire Town Hall staff and board. Please join us for the next 3 weeks, as we continue this series. Next week, we'll be talking about Dick Gregory with the great Dr. Mark Anthony Neal of Duke University. I suggest, if you have Showtime, that you go ahead and watch the one and only Dick Gregory, a documentary about Dick Gregory that just came out. And in general, I suggest, because of what we talked about today, because of the music, because of the 70s, that you also go this time to Hulu to watch Summer of Soul, a documentary about the Harlem Cultural Festival in 1969, which was called the Black Woodstock. So thank you all for coming. Join us next week. Same time, same place. Thank you.